Hello, Kentucky. How could Cayden Daughtry have forced Duke's next move? And that's bad for Kentucky since Cayden is a recruit Pope is targeting. And now what will this be like? Let's see what's new. What if one of the biggest recent risers in the 2027 recruiting class is starting to change the way major programs view the entire recruiting picture? That may be exactly what is happening with Cayden Daughtry. The five-star guard has been drawing major attention after impressive performances on the Nike EYBL circuit and at the Nike Peach Jam. And now even a program like Duke could be facing a decision that did not seem particularly likely before. And that matters a lot for Kentucky. Cayden Daughtry is not an unknown name to the Wildcats. Mark Pope is targeting the guard, which means any change in the way his recruitment is viewed deserves close attention. Until recently, Daughtry was considered a high-level recruit, but he was not necessarily the most well-known player or the prospect dominating every conversation surrounding the 2027 class. That has changed over the last few weeks. And when a player starts turning strong performances into a sustained stretch of production that attracts attention from across college basketball, the programs involved have to react. For Kentucky, that means monitoring the situation closely. For Duke, it could even mean reconsidering its own recruiting plans. That is where this story becomes especially interesting. Duke has been involved with several recruits in the 2027 class, which is generally viewed as a relatively weak class overall compared with some recent groups. That naturally changes the way a program has to evaluate its priorities. When there is not a huge number of consensus elite talents at the top of a class, individual developments can carry even more weight. And Cayden Daughtry is going through exactly that kind of development in terms of attention. The five-star guard had already been viewed as a high-level prospect, but his recent performances have pushed his name into another conversation. During Session 4 of the Nike EYBL season in Las Vegas, Daughtry put up impressive numbers. Then he continued to attract attention at the Nike Peach Jam while playing for the Florida Rebels. That matters because this is not simply about one isolated performance. Daughtry has put together a recent stretch that has placed his name firmly in the middle of the discussion surrounding the 2027 class. And that change in perception could create an interesting problem for programs that were already evaluating their next moves. For Duke, the situation is particularly curious. In some ways, it did not make a tremendous amount of sense for the program to become heavily involved with Daughtry. That is precisely the part of the story that could be changing. When a recruit begins showing a level of play capable of changing how people view him, previous evaluations have to be reconsidered. Jon Scheyer and his staff may have to take another look at Daughtry. That does not mean Duke has made a final decision, and it certainly does not guarantee anything about the future of the recruitment. The point is much simpler and, at the same time, extremely important. Daughtry's recent performances may have given Duke enough reason to reconsider its position. And that is where Kentucky enters the picture. Because when Mark Pope is targeting a player at this level, the last thing the Wildcats want is to see another elite program increase its attention on the same recruit. Daughtry was already an important name for Kentucky. Now, after the attention he has received over the last few weeks, his recruitment may require even more careful handling. Mark Pope cannot simply assume that the initial evaluation of Daughtry will remain the same several months from now. The recruiting landscape can change quickly, especially when a player begins putting together performances that make more programs recognize his potential. And that may be the biggest point of this entire situation. Cayden Daughtry has always been a high-level recruit. What has changed is the amount of attention surrounding him. That may sound like a small difference, but in recruiting, it could be a major one. A player can spend months being monitored by different programs without necessarily being at the center of their priorities. Then a few major performances put that player in the spotlight, and suddenly those same programs begin looking at him differently. Daughtry appears to be entering that moment right now. And for Kentucky, that makes every move even more important. Mark Pope already has interest in the player, so the possibility of Duke reconsidering its position is something the Wildcats need to monitor very closely. If a program like Duke begins viewing Daughtry as a much bigger priority than it did previously, the competition naturally becomes more complicated. And it is not only about Duke's name. It is about the effect that a change like this can have on the rest of the recruitment. When a prospect starts gaining significant attention, his group of interested programs can change. Teams that were previously just monitoring him can begin increasing their efforts. Programs that were already interested can intensify their pursuit. And teams that had the player as a priority can realize they need to act with even more urgency and consistency. That is why Mark Pope's attention needs to be redoubled. Kentucky cannot control what Duke decides to do. It cannot control which programs begin paying more attention to Daughtry after these performances. But it can control how closely it continues to follow the recruit's development and how strongly it continues to show its interest. And that becomes even more important because Daughtry is not simply receiving attention because he is a five-star recruit. He is receiving attention because his recent performances are changing the conversation around his name. That distinction is important. A ranking can place a player among the top prospects in a recruiting class. But standout performances can cause programs to view that player differently. That appears to be exactly what is happening with Daughtry. He was already on the radar. Now, he is becoming much harder to ignore. And for Kentucky, that means the recruitment could be entering a more competitive phase. The situation also shows why Mark Pope and his staff need to monitor not only the players they are recruiting, but also what other programs are doing. Duke's interest, if it increases because of these performances, does not happen in a vacuum. It can influence how other programs evaluate Daughtry as well. The more attention he receives, the greater the competition could become. And that puts even more responsibility on Kentucky. The Wildcats need to continue treating Daughtry for what he is right now, a five-star recruit who is generating an enormous amount of attention through his recent performances. And there is an important difference between saying Kentucky has a problem and saying Kentucky needs to be alert. Right now, the second point is the one that matters. There is no reason to treat the situation as though the recruitment is lost. The information does not establish that. What we have is a change in the level of attention surrounding Daughtry and the possibility that Duke may need to reconsider its involvement. That alone is enough to make this situation much more interesting. Because Kentucky was interested in a player who was already considered one of the top talents in the 2027 class. Now, that same player is receiving even more attention after strong performances in Las Vegas and at the Peach Jam. And the more his name grows, the more important Kentucky's presence in the recruitment becomes. Mark Pope needs to be paying attention. He needs to monitor what is happening. And, most importantly, he needs to recognize that the situation surrounding Daughtry may not look the same as it did before these recent performances. That may ultimately be the biggest impact of all. Cayden Daughtry has not simply changed his own position within a class. He may be causing programs like Duke to reevaluate their priorities. And when that happens with a player Kentucky is already targeting, the implication for the Wildcats is clear. The competition deserves much more attention. Daughtry has managed to turn his recent performances into something bigger than simply good numbers. He has put his name at the center of the conversation. And now programs that may not have viewed his recruitment the same way before could be forced to reconsider their evaluations. Duke could be going through exactly that process. And Kentucky needs to watch every step. For Mark Pope, this is an opportunity to recognize that Daughtry's recruitment may be entering a new phase. The player was already important. Now, the competition surrounding him could become even more significant. At the end of the day, that may be exactly what makes this story so interesting for Kentucky. Cayden Daughtry did not come out of nowhere. He was already a high-level recruit, but his performances during Session 4 of the Nike EYBL in Las Vegas and at the Nike Peach Jam with the Florida Rebels have made many more people pay attention. And when a player starts generating that kind of reaction, the programs involved have to respond. Duke may be reconsidering its approach, and Kentucky cannot afford to simply watch from a distance. Mark Pope needs to keep his attention firmly on this recruitment, because the more Daughtry's profile grows across college basketball, the more important every move surrounding him becomes. For now, the main takeaway is simple. Cayden Daughtry has elevated the level of attention around his recruitment. Duke may be reconsidering its position, and Kentucky needs to be prepared for a battle that could become more competitive precisely because the recruit Mark Pope is becoming harder and harder to ignore.